Okay, so welcome back. We're going to do section 5. Now, I'm going to do actually sections 5, 6, and 7 on this video. They're all MuleSoft. Okay. And one of them only has like one question anyway. So, or maybe two. So I'm going to bring together sections 5, 6, and 7 because they're all relevant to MuleSoft. So here we go. All right. This next question is, well, is whole section 5 is any point platform to design, deliver, manage APIs. That's the life cycle of our API and how they will integrate with the hyperautomation project. So that is the objective here that we're talking about. All right. So when the get records action is used in a Salesforce flow, which subset of records is returned from Salesforce? Okay, so we're looking at a get records action that's in a Salesforce flow. So what is returned from Salesforce? Which subset of records? Is it the metadata records? Is it all the records owned by a group? A standard object record only? Or is it one or many object records? Okay, so as we look through this and we see a get records action, A is the correct answer here. It's one or many object records. Okay, so that would make sense that we're getting records, not any of these other options here. Okay, next one. Which API layer meets these requirements? And then we can come here and say all the APIs need to provide access to backend databases and insulate users from complexity or any changes to underlying applications. That right there should tell us the purpose of a system API, even without reading this up here, but the purpose of a system API is to provide access to a backend database. Okay, it does insulate the users from whatever the means in which that database has got to be interacted with. So in this case, of course, it's A, the system API. One thing to note is that for the real exam, they're going to have variations of these questions. Don't just assume, oh, it's a system API. Read it to be sure that you're making the right choice. Okay. All right. So the next one is NTO. Well, let's see, which API tier? So we're talking about tiers again. Which API tier should the interaction with databases take place? Okay. So right there, that's an indication. When we're talking about retrieving data from the database, aggregating and transforming data provides data to mobile and web interfaces. Again, the database is going to be the system API. System API. All right. If it were to be something in regards to, there is going to be a web interface or a mobile app or something like that, that would lead you to an experience API. If you're talking about transforming data, any kind of orchestration of that data, or it would be in the process API group. There is not a network API tier. The three tiers are the experience, the process, and the system APIs. Okay, next up, when must the RAML specification of the API be updated? Okay, so it says NTO has updated its order API implementation. When must the RAML specification be updated? All right, so let's take a look at these options here and see when this should be updated as far as that's concerned. All right, so starting from the bottom, when the order API implementation, that's the application. So when you're looking at the implementation, when the order API implementation changes from interacting with a legacy backend system deployed on-prem to a modern cloud-based system. Okay, so we're talking about this implementation going from on-prem to a modern cloud-based system. Our specification should not change in that case. Okay, it should not change. When the order API implementation is migrated from an older or newer version of the Mule runtime. Now, the runtime would still not have a bearing on our specifications. Okay. When it is optimized to improve the average response time. Okay, average response time, that still will not change anything in our specification. But if the structure of the request or response changes, or any of the data fields change, or the requirements, whether they're required or not, changes, that's when it would impact. So A is the correct answer. That's when it should be updated. All right. Which approach should any airlines take to minimize the impact of this change? Okay, so we want to minimize the impact of the change. So any airlines is using API-led connectivity approach when creating their APIs. Due to recent modifications in their business rules, a process API implementation change is required. Okay, what approach should we take to minimize the impact of this change on their API clients? Okay, so minimize the change. Update the specification of the current process API and notify them by sending them the updated specification. All right, so we could do that. We could update the spec and let them know that it's changed. Okay, but that also that's not really minimizing the impact as much. All right, so although D could be done. Let's read C. Develop a new API version with V2. All right, a V2 means that we've totally, upgraded it and it's not backwards compatible. Okay, so V2 means it's not backwards compatible. And in this one, it says, and have the old API implementation return a status code 301 move permanently. Well, that's not a great experience. That is not going to minimize the impact of the clients. That's going to actually prove to be disruptive. All right, and B is postpone the changes until API consumers acknowledge they're ready to migrate to a new API version. Yeah, that's not necessarily even following a best practices of waiting. I mean, if you have a smaller shop enough, you might could go that route, but that's not really advisable. Let's look at create a new API version with V2 and inform your V1 API consumers that it's going to hit end of life. All right, now that is actually the correct answer. That's the correct answer. This is what you would want to do. Now, you could inform them you've got who is currently using your V1, and you can let them know there's a new version here for them to transition over to. Okay, so A is the correct answer there. All right, number 43, which AnyPoint component is responsible for producing your API statistics, including your policy violations? Okay, statistics, including policy violations. Now, this information could actually be found in AnyPoint monitoring, but that's where it's not gathering this data together. Okay, Runtime Manager is not going to be tracking this, nor is Flex Gateway. There's a feature called AnyPoint Analytics. It's sometimes missed, but it is in AnyPoint. It is in an API Manager, and AnyPoint Analytics does gather the details of the API statistics, policy violations, client ID and client secret details. So it provides quite a bit. The actual answer here is AnyPoint Analytics. Now you would think, oh yeah, monitoring. Well, that information is available on monitoring, but they're aiming for analytics. You get a report here. It's actually a report. Okay, next up is which 3 capabilities are provided by AnyPoint platform? So we want to look through the 3 that are going to provide us some details here. Experience Site Builder. That's a Salesforce feature. Chatbot capabilities. Again, that's a Salesforce feature. Out-of-the-box system connectors is clearly a MuleSoft Anypoint Platform product or capability. API management and deployment. Again, that's on API on Anypoint Platform. API discovery and documentation, again, within Exchange. Okay. So the top three, A, B, and C, are the correct answer. Again, if you get to choose three, make sure you watch that and you do choose three. Okay. All right, Northern Trail Outfitters. They need to allow certain IP addresses. Okay. And which Anypoint Platform component requires a change to fulfill this. So we want an IP allow list to access that API. Create an allow list policy in Exchange. Well, Exchange is not where you find that policy. Create an allow list in Access Management. Access Management is not where you would create that, nor in Runtime Manager. A is the correct answer. API Manager, if you remember from the lifecycle of the API, is where we added the policies, and this is a policy. Okay. Next one, which MuleSoft deployment strategy consists of the control plane and the runtime plane being hosted by MuleSoft? So the control plane is the Anypoint Platform that we work off of to manage that web interface, to manage our access into the Anypoint Platform. So we have, everything from access management to managing our APIs, governance, runtime, runtime manager. So that is the control plane, anypoint.mulesoft.com. The runtime plane is where we're going to deploy our applications to. So when we talked about the different types of deployment models, we've got, let's start with Private Cloud Edition. Now, Private Cloud Edition means that Anypoint Platform and wherever they're deploying their apps to, which would be a server in the case of Private Cloud Edition, that would be managed by the customer. The customer manages both of these, okay? Hybrid means that it will be using the control plane or anypoint.mulesoft.com managed by MuleSoft, but on their own servers. Okay, so that's not a fit. Runtime Fabric, same thing. Runtime Fabric is going to be the MuleSoft, anypoint.mulesoft.com, but they're also deploying and managing their Mule applications over top of Kubernetes. Okay, so that's a customer hosted environment with Kubernetes. So the last option is Cloud Hub, and Cloud Hub allows us to manage our MuleSoft applications in anypoint.mulesoft.com and deploy them to Cloud Hub. Okay, so that one is Cloud Hub. So those are really centered around the deployment strategies. And, so you'd want to refresh that so you are aware of the different types of models. So the Private Cloud Edition, the Hybrid, Runtime Fabric, and Cloud Hub 1 or 2. Both of those would be the same. All right, now section 6, like I said, I'm going to go ahead and include 6 and 7 together. They're all part of MuleSoft. All right, here we go. This is going to be very similar in the previous question. Which two MuleSoft deployment strategies consist of the control plane? Again, remember that's anypoint.mulesoft.com, hosted by MuleSoft, and the runtime plane hosted by the client in this case. And you've got to choose two. So we're looking for a customer hosted runtime, either by their own servers or Kubernetes. Okay. So Private Cloud Edition, if you remember, that means that the customer is hosting both of them. They have their own version of anypoint.mulesoft.com, all running inside of their own network. Cloud Hub, MuleSoft is hosting both of those. So the correct answer is hybrid and runtime fabric. That is where anypoint.mulesoft.com is hosted by MuleSoft, and the runtime plane is hosted by the customer. Runtime fabric running over top of Kubernetes. Hybrid is on their own servers, whether it's a physical server, bare metal server in a data center, or whether it is a cloud provider that they spin up a VM and have the servers running there. All right. Next up, the core system of NTO can only handle a certain number of requests in a given time. The API that accesses it should be protected from excessive traffic. What policy included in API Manager serves this purpose? Now, I have mentioned to you that I do recommend that you review and study the policies in API Manager. Okay, study those. See what ones are policies and what ones are not policies. So, and what they do, for example. So we're looking at this list, and we need to protect an API from excessive traffic. That means we want to control and limit and queue some of the requests coming in. Okay. So in this case, the options, header removal would have nothing to do with it. Caching would also have nothing to do with the excessive amount of requests coming its way. Now, the two that I could see that would control that to some degree would be rate limiting or spike control. Now, when we talk about it controlling and protecting that API from excessive traffic, we're talking really more, the correct answer is spike control. Now, what spike control does is it limits the amount of traffic coming in to a certain number of requests, right? And as all of these requests are coming in here, when it gets full of the amount of requests that are allowed, it's going to queue those requests. It has a queuing mechanism. Okay, so it's going to queue up any overflow. And then when these messages are processed, then some of the ones from the queue come back in and will process through. So spike control does work to protect that backend system that is we're discussing that we want to do that with. Now, when the queue is full, so you have this threshold here. This is like a threshold of what you're going to allow. And when the queue, like the overflow, gets full, it will error out. You will get an error if that queue is full. If that queue is not full, then what's going to happen is as these messages process here, or there's availability in that threshold, it'll pull them from the queue. Okay, so spike control is the correct answer in this case. All right. Now let's look at the next one that has a high rate of transactions per second. Okay, high rate per second in a given period of time. Which API policy should be used to impose a limit based on the type of client application that they are? You know, maybe they're a paid service versus a free service. Okay, so based on the type of client application, that an agreement that they have made to access that API, cross-origin resource sharing doesn't apply. Client ID enforcement, now that would require them to have the client ID and client secret. That's just an, you know, kind of like an authentication type thing. Spike control is managed a little differently from the excess traffic in the previous question here. So rate limiting, SLA based, is going to be the one that does limit it based on the kind of client application or kind of client agreement that we have. Okay. So this, in this case, is going to be the rate limiting SLA. Study those policies, know the difference between them. You will have scenarios of which policy you would use to facilitate a particular solution. Okay. All right, the next one is how should any line airlines configure a notification in API monitoring? So let's see what kind of notification we need. They deploy a new app to Cloud Hub that'll be accessed by RPA bots and Salesforce flows. They want to be notified immediately if the API begins experience response times greater than 30 seconds. Okay, so this is going to be based on response times more than 30 seconds. How should they configure this notification? All right, we can set up an email alert when the average response time, depending on that by endpoint. We can set up a dashboard, same thing. Set up a Cloud Hub alert for response time, or set an API alert for response time. Okay, and actually the correct answer is A. We would want to set up an API alert for that response time. Okay, that is the correct answer. All right, so I know some of these you're like, why wouldn't it be? Why couldn't it be? Well, you would have to look at the alerts. Okay, there is there is outbound average response time by endpoint that is in monitoring, but it does not come with an email alert in monitoring. You could have a dashboard alert. There are custom dashboards, but easy enough in API Manager, you can set up an API alert for the response times. Okay, Cloud Hub alert would not apply. Cloud Hub alert would. There is a Cloud Hub connector that you can use for Cloud Hub 1, and you can set up some custom alerts, but that's not the answer they're looking for. So there's going to be some truths to some of the answers, but they're looking for like the best answer, and that would be the API alert for the response time. Okay. Section 7. Okay, section 7. Now, again, this is MuleSoft is about exchange. Use any point exchange to catalog share, discover, learn about, and reuse hyperautomation assets. Okay, so it says, listen, again, as you know, I always say, come down to the question that is right above your answers first. And it is, which anypoint monitoring application panel and API panel metrics meet these requirements? Okay, so let's go back up. Anypoint Airlines deploys an API that provides access to their flight information. This API is secured by client and SLA tiers. Client and SLA tiers. It's consumed by business units that implement Mule applications and RPA processes. The ops team is setting up an anypoint monitoring dashboard to see which client applications send the most requests and which endpoints receive the most requests. Okay, so we want to know from the client side, the client app, and we also want to know from the endpoints of which ones are receiving the most, right? Okay, so which anypoint monitoring application panel and API panel metrics? So we want to know really which metrics are going to meet those requirements. Receive the most requests and send the most requests. Okay, so we're looking at here, it says outbound average request count by endpoint. Well, we want the inbound, right? We don't want the outbound. We want to know which ones receive the most. So a lot of them are just really filtering through the question, determining the answer. Okay, request by client IP, that's not a metric we're after, right? It doesn't matter what the IP address of the client requests. Maybe request by client ID, yeah. Okay, so client ID and the inbound average request. So it's A and B. It's A and B. Again, you got to choose two there. Make sure you've got that right on the choose two. Oh, this is a good one. Okay. In any point exchange, which three life cycle states are available? You got to choose three. That's the life cycle state of an API. Life cycle state of an API. So that means when you have worked on a design in Design Center and you're publishing your asset to Exchange, it's going to give you an option to choose the life cycle state of your API. And at that point, you have two choices. Okay. When you are choosing the life cycle state of your API, it's going to give you the option of stable or development. Okay. Stable means that it's ready to be used in a Mule app and it's ready to be consumed. Development means you're still working on it and therefore others cannot import it into Studio to use it as an interface. It won't even show up on the list if it's in development. Okay. And then the third life cycle state is deprecated. And that means when an API has been replaced or no longer in use, and you want to put it in a deprecated state before you actually delete it. Okay. And there is not a testing or feature like that. So those two are not even options. They're not accurate. So A, B, and C. Any airlines has a requirement to validate APIs with simulated behavior in a mocking service and engage the API consumers early in development to avoid any more rework. Okay, so that means they want to test out that API where it's kind of simulated using fake data. Or in our case, we refer to it as example data so that others can interact with that API and see, is that what they're looking for? Is this what they intended? Which two tools enable them to meet these requirements? Okay, so when we create the specification in Designer, we're able to interact with our API and test it out as we're doing the design. Any team members that are in that org, in that business group, can also test that out as well, because as long as you have provided example data in your specification, the mocking service will have data that is able to provide. The mocking service uses that example data, and we're able to see it in Designer. And when we publish that specification to Exchange, we're also able to interact with that mocking service in Exchange. So the mocking service is using our example data from our specification to provide simulated data, to see that simulated behavior. Okay, so it's A and B, Designer and Exchange. All right, there we go. We've got some code here. And what the question is, again, come down here to the question. And it says, according to best practices, what should the version number be when these changes are updated and the API is deployed to Exchange? Now, Anypoint Platform by default uses semantic versioning. So this question is centered around semantic versioning. And in semantic versioning, we've got three positions. You see the three positions here. So I'm going to say we have a 1.0.0. Okay. And in semantic versioning, we have the version here that is the, I need to look up and see exactly what it's called. Hold on. I don't want to label this. There we go. Okay, so semantic versioning. Here we go. I always want to call it minor. but it's actually the first position is the patch. Okay, so this means that you're gonna create a change that is like a debug or a document or something that doesn't really matter, right? It's backwards compatible. It's you've either fixed something or you've made it better. Okay. Now this next position here is the minor version change. And what that means basically is that it is a minor change. You have added new functionality. Okay, you've added something new, maybe a new endpoint or a new data field, but it's not a required field, so it's not going to break anything. But it gives more functionality to that endpoint in what you provided before. But it is backwards compatible. Okay, so it is backwards compatible. All right, and then the first position here is your major version. And that's where you're going to actually change it so drastically, like from a V1 to a V2. And these are not compatible. Whatever you changed in this specification and you created a totally new instance, a new asset that's a V2 is not going to be compatible with what they were using in V1. Okay. So that's semantic versioning, and that's what you're going to see in it on the exam. Semantic versioning. It's going to come together just like something like this. All right. So let's see what this says. The current version number is a 1.6.3. Okay. Then you've got to figure out what got changed. Okay. What got changed? So here's our specification. A new version of the API is being developed that will add the ability to query for a certain flight. So this is what got added. Okay, instead of just a get, that's still here. So anyone that was using the get now can have a get by ID feature if they want to use it. If they want to use it, it's still available. Okay. So if we come up here and we look at these answers, we can determine that we're currently running the 1.6.3 and it is backwards compatible. Is a new version needed? It is still working and compatible with the original. So that would not be a major version change. Okay. This next one is increasing the one here that is the patch version. And that means a very minor change documentation, and it does not apply to that. So it is not the D. It is not the C. A major version change here, and that they're saying it's incompatible. Well, it's not incompatible. You still have the compatibility here. So it is not that one. Instead, A is the correct answer. It is backwards compatible, right? It is a minor version change, but I want you to look at this number. That's important, okay? So for a minor version change, we're at 1.6.3. You do not go to 1.7.3. That is not correct. You do go to 1.7.0, okay? So know that if it increases, like it increased here because it was a new minor version, it would be a 1.7.0. Okay, so be sure to note that. Be sure to note that. All right, so that's semantic versioning wrapped in with some code here too. And lastly, a REST API specification is updated with a new required input argument for the post method. The previous one was published to Anypoint Exchange as a 3.2.1. Following the MuleSoft recommended semantic versioning, what should the new version be for this updated REST API asset? Okay, again, we're talking about the versioning. So we want to watch the versioning of this. And so if it's a 3.2.1, and what we have done is, let's see, is updated a new required input. New required input. Okay. New required input. That means the previous version here is not going to work under the new one. Okay. And because it's required, then the previous version of the 3.2.1, what would the new updated REST API asset be? It would be D a 4.0.0. Okay. 4.0.0. So as we're looking at semantic versioning, and if it's a new required input argument for the post, then we want to know that it would change all the way to a 4.0.0. Okay, 4.0. Now, I know in the answer guide, FYI, the answer guide is going to say it's A. Okay, but really the semantic versioning would be, because it's a required input argument for the post, a 4.0.0. All right. And that brings us to section 8, which is Salesforce Flow Orchestrator. So I'm going to stop here. We're going to stop with the MuleSoft. I'll have a new one for orchestration, and see you in the next video.